Hello, folks. This is Don Flemons, the American Songster, and you're listening to Walking the Floor.
I'm walking the floor over you.
Walking the floor.
I'm walking the floor. Walking the floor over you. Hola, senors and senoritas. This is Chris Shiflett, and you're listening to episode 197 of your favorite podcast, Walking the Floor. It's been a minute. I've been off fighting foo. It's been quite busy. As you may have heard, rock and roll is back. Live music is back, and we've been out there doing some shows. It's also summer, so, give me a break. Taking it easy, okay? I haven't been taking it easy. I've been working. Yeah, you probably know we played the Canyon Club. We played Madison Square Garden. We just announced the show at the Forum and a bunch of other good stuff coming up, and it's all been really great and super fun. Except Ricky Schroeder got mad at us because we're pushing the Bill Gates vaccination or whatever on unsuspecting fans. But besides that, great shows. Great to be back. Great to be in a room full of people having a good time listening to some live rock and roll, and I really can't complain. It's good. And I'm going to try to pick up the pace on the podcast. I still got a bunch in the can, and I got publicists banging down my door to get their artists on the show, so I got to get on it. But isn't that always the state of this show? I got to get on it, and I got to get caught up. So we'll see what happens. All right, let's talk about Zounds.com's, our good friends at Zounds.com, I should say, where you get free shipping on every order. No exceptions, no exclusions. Zounds has 3 warehouses strategically located across the United States, so you can get your gear faster than anybody else. And over 90% of Zounds orders arrive within 2 days or less. So get on over there and get what you need as far as your music gear is going. Sounds.com. All right, let's get to today's interview. It's a good one. All right, Dom Flemons is today's guest on the podcast, who you may know from his time with Carolina Chocolate Drops, where he first came to fame, or his solo records that he's made. He is a self-described, historically based artist, and kind of has like a professorial vibe about him. I felt like I just kind of would ask him questions here and there, and I just sat back and soaked it up and learned a lot, because honestly, I didn't know really anything about black cowboys in the American West and the music that they made and were a part of, and how that ties into country music history. And we covered a lot of information here, and it's really good. So let's get to it. This is the American Songster, Dom Flemons, on Walking the Floor. Okay, listen, I gotta warn you, I got my second Moderna shot yesterday afternoon, and I feel pretty good right now. I feel a little space brain, but I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop, because like most of the people I know that have gotten the Moderna second shot seems to be the one that gives people the heebie-jeebies. So I'm waiting. If I lose focus in the middle of the interview, you'll know what happened. If I'm like, it's just the Bill Gates chip settling in. You know? So I
got my first one. I got the second one on the way in the next couple of weeks. So I'm gearing up myself.
Yeah, and one of these days we'll actually get back out on the road, right?
Oh yeah, one of these days.
Have you been doing any shows at all? Where are you based?
Well, now I'm based out of Chicago. I was in Washington, D.C. up until recently, and I'm actually gearing up to do the Grand Ole Opry later today. So I'm in Nashville. Oh, wow. And then I have a couple of gigs in North Carolina that I'm going to do. But I've had a couple of occasional in-person, social distanced and whatnot, but mostly it's been virtual.
Yeah. How are they doing the Opry right now? Are they putting people in there?
It's a very, very limited capacity, and everything backstage is extremely socially distanced. It's dressing room to stage, and that's about it.
Yeah. I mean, what you been working on this year? I imagine you, like most of us, had a a year mostly off, but are you, it's been a minute since you put out a new record. Have you been gearing up some songs or doing some recording, anything like that?
Oh, yeah, well, I mean, I've been writing some new material, and I'm starting to piece together what's going to be the next record. So that's starting to happen. A lot of my time has been spent actually with my family. I got a 3-year-old daughter, so past year was a good time for 2 to 3 years old. So I got a lot of family time in there. I've been doing actually a lot of writing actually recently. Did a little bit of writing for the Alan Lomax collection as well as there's a new edition of my friend Jerry Zoltan's book on the Dixie hummingbird. So I wrote a little intro for that. And
like writing, not songwriting.
Writing.
Okay.
And things like that.
Has that always been something you've done? Because I know you wrote pretty extensive liner notes for that Black Cowboys record, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. All the writing from any of those albums, the Carolina Chocolate Drops and whatnot, I always tried to bring in some a little bit of adventure to the liner notes, because the liner notes can be their own sort of adventure, especially when getting into historic music, because you kind of always want to have people, you want them to try to delve deeper and reach farther into the past and the present, and so I've always tried to do that, and I got a degree in it. That's I actually have a BA in English, so that's my college work. But I've always tried to bring that critical thinking into my music, so that it can just have its own story.
Were you doing that at the same time as your music? Were those things kind of in parallel, or did one come before the other and influence? You know what I mean? Has that always impacted what you've done musically?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I first was really into poetry and into writing. And then shortly afterward, I started to play guitar. I mean, I started playing drums in school. That was my first musical training. But I guess I was about 16 or 17, and I started getting deep into, the Beatles and Bob Dylan and Jimi Hendrix, and I started writing songs. And I did that for 4 or 5 years. Never did really try to do it as a profession necessarily. But once I found that once I got into older folk songs, and then I got into the older styles, I found that there was this sort of I found it was avant-garde to have traditional music in my repertoire. So then I started that wholesale, and that then turned into its own sort of my songwriting branched off into my old time style. So then my songwriting started to take on a lot of that old time feel.
I'm curious about that because I've had my own struggles with that a bit as far as songwriting. I'm wondering how you approach writing in an older style, because for me, there was a period there years ago where I was got really deep dive into Buck Owens and the early sort of honky tonk West Coast thing that was happening. And I was really intentionally trying to write songs that sounded like that and felt like that. And I kind of realized I was really aping the language of the time, which wasn't really native to me. And that was a weird stumbling block that I had to kind of get over in my own songwriting. So how do you approach that?
Well, that's why I was so thankful that I got all of my time in North Carolina that I did. Because once I left Phoenix and started to live in Chapel Hill, and I started to go and visit some of the older blues singers, I started to figure out a way to find the balance between referencing back and stepping into my own space. And so I struggle with that all the time as well. I tell people I make lost records sometimes. I take an artist and I make a lost record of an artist, and I try to just fool my mind into doing that. But also
sort of stepping into them almost as a character.
Exactly. And then,
then
trying to write in a stylistic frame of mind. And of course, that's the other thing though too, is you have to be wary of making sure that you're not putting on or changing or coming up with phrases that don't fit your own personal vocabulary and language. So that's also a big thing I struggle with as well, is making sure that whatever I'm saying is something that seems realistic and seems like something that is natural to me personally, as well as fitting within the style.
Yeah. That's interesting. I heard an interview with Brad Paisley recently where he said anytime he's writing a song and he's struggling with a lyric, that it almost always is because it's not something he would actually say.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
sort of like trying to keep it conversational or something, you know?
Well, absolutely. Like when I was studying writing years ago, they used to mention two things, which was trying to figure out ways to describe a situation without saying the direct situation itself, and letting the details be able to tell you the scene. And then the other thing, of course, is trying to make sure that your voice is clear, whatever it might be, because it's very it, again, getting caught up in styles, it can be easy to put the style ahead of the quality of the underlying factor. Because of course, a lot of the greatest songs that people have heard have a universal quality as a song. Instead of it being said artist or said style, a song usually pans out in the most basic bare bones form. And so when thinking of that with songwriting, that's something I always try to do. And especially as a solo performer, having to usually figure out how to play all the different parts, whatever they may be, the lead or the rhythm. I'm always conscious of trying to figure out what are the audio stylistic references I want to bring into my songs, and then what are the new messages I want to bring to my material. Like I have one song on the Black Cowboys, Steel Pony Blues, and one verse that I ended up writing was, "I'm getting far too old to follow this here herd," because I caught the first thing smoking down the road somewhere, and I caught my steel pony and boys, I'm going to ride. And that notion came to me. First, I was starting to write a song about a black cowboy by the name of Nat Love. But when a line like that came into my mind, it also had a double meaning. At the moment when I was creating Black Cowboys, I found that the digital age had taken full effect and was pushing ever harder forward. And the notion was to continue to make more material. And to push more material outward, and content has always been king.
Yeah.
And so with that song, I took a little bit of the idea of Nat Love's story of becoming a Pullman porter after being a cowboy, and sort of brought this notion of he is taking a step back. But also there's a notion of a general stepping back from technology, moving forward in the rat race. And so I try to bring small nuggets and proverbs into my songwriting a lot of time like that.
Yeah, I was curious actually listening to that record. Like, are those songs that you wrote about those stories, or are those old classic songs that those guys were singing out on the range?
Oh, those the three songs on there that I wrote were $1 Bill, which I wrote thinking about Bill Pickett. There was a Steel Pony Blues about Nat Love, and then there was He's a Lone Ranger about Bass Reeves. And each of those three gentlemen happened to be three very iconic characters of the West that I thought had a very strong universal appeal. And also they were fairly well known in the circles that know Black Cowboy material. So that was also something I thought would be really cool, to just be able to jump into that space and be able to create new songs off of these stories that were engaging and exciting, but they had no songs necessarily associated with them. And so that was sort of the notion. Of course, Steel Pony Blues and $1 Bill are slightly broader in terms of the lyrics. I didn't want to do a straight biography like I did on He's a Lone Ranger, which has just mostly biographical information written in a poetry form. Steel Pony Blues, that one ended up taking on a couple of different lives of its own, because the idea of cowboys transitioning to Pullman porters, to me, opened up this whole aspect of African-American history that leads up into the modern era, and particularly the civil rights movement and the brotherhood of sleeping cars with the Pullman porters and
Sure.
Randolph. And so
Philip Randolph, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So it kind of expanded itself into sort of a broad idea of what movement can be. Steel Pony Blues in some ways is is sort of mirrored by the song "Poor Howard's Dead and Gone" from Leadbelly. And at first, it would have seemed easy just to do "When I Was a Cowboy" because it says that in the title. But
Right.
the song "Poor Howard's Dead and Gone" and "He Left Me Here to Sing This Song," that has a quality to it that speaks of the emotional struggles of migration and movement and rebuilding. And so I started to think about the Black Cowboy story as being that idea of migration and movement and rebuilding, because that's kind of the underlying story. Because of course the who, what, when, and where can be found. The why
Right.
Black Cowboys was the struggle from the beginning. So in writing the songs, I ended up finding that too. I just had to
And
find what
and
songs told it.
what was that like post Reconstruction is what you're talking about, right? I mean, that was that when the big migration out west by African American
Yeah,
cowboys.
on the album, I ended up focusing on the like right after the Emancipation Proclamation, basically going up into like say the 1940s and 50s and 60s. When it comes to the Pullman Porters part of the story, but there's the Black West as a notion and as a sort of a historical sect of American history. It's so multifaceted that I struggled with figuring out which stories I should tell and which stories I shouldn't tell, or I just didn't have time for. So I took 18 different stories and placed that into the context of the record. Of course, I had other albums that were country and Western albums that I've always been big fans of. My dad was a big country and Western fan, so cowboy songs and cowboy music was something that I've always loved, even though I hadn't performed it a bunch. But I had albums like "The Red-Headed Stranger" by Willie Nelson,
Sure,
and the
sure.
sparseness of that album, or even Marty Robbins' Gunfighter Ballads and Trail Songs. And that was another album that I thought about. And I thought that those two albums particularly had great universal appeal. If you weren't familiar with cowboy music in general, these are great albums just to listen to, and then you can become more familiar. So I wanted to be able to figure out how to create that sort of appeal with Black Cowboys. And then of course there was the Smithsonian, which that was fun to be able to connect with them too on that.
Were you able to? I'm curious about Smithsonian Folkways as a label, like putting out music through them. Is that like having a really good editor? Like, do they get involved in what you're doing, or get involved in some of the song selection, or sort of who you're focusing on? And do you have access to all their archives to do the research?
Well, when it came to the song selection and a lot of and the conceptual idea, that was all mine there. And I brought that to Smithsonian Folkways. What they ended up doing, for one, Smithsonian Folkways has a great catalog of cowboy material within it. So I also came in knowing that they knew what to do with cowboy song, because of course, cowboy songs is neither truly country and Western, nor is it straight folk music. So it's kind of a funny genre of music, and I knew that Folkways would know what to do with that.
Right.
I also knew that they had the African American Legacy series with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and so I at that time they didn't have any contemporary artists on that series, and so I made the pitch to be the first contemporary artist to do a album on that Legacy series. And I felt again that Black Cowboys was such a strong subject that it would be a great place to have that album sitting in the museum and being a part of their collection. And so it was sort of, I came in with those notions. But what Smithsonian Folkways did was they have just a wonderful design team, and they took the materials that I had laid out, and they spruced them up, and then they brought in additional materials as well. And also their wonderful team did a lot of the clearances for many of the museum archives that we used. Like on the back of the Black Cowboys record, there's a wonderful picture from the Amon Carter Museum, and so they reached out to them. And I've also been in touch with the Leadbelly estate, his niece Tarika Dean, and so she also let us license out a wonderful photo of Leadbelly. So it was a wonderful collaborative effort. But Smithsonian Folkways, of course, is it's like being in a beautiful Cadillac, and so it was the album took on a whole other beautiful design, I guess, a spruce up, and the presentation just ended up coming together just wonderfully. Of course, then there's Timothy Duffy as well, who I've known for years, and I sort of pre-gamed a lot of the tintype photography ahead of time, hoping that, whenever I got together, that recreations of old time cowboy tintypes would be something that would be really cool to see in the liner notes.
I have to admit, I haven't actually held it in my hands, but I watched somebody on YouTube scroll through it. So I'm going to bug your management to send me one so I can feel it. I mean, it's a really interesting concept because, I think of like cowboy culture, that was real old time, frontier cowboy culture is kind of one of the bedrock foundations of, one of the great American myths of sort of we're all in this alone. It's sort of anti-movement in its character, and to have you connect that to like Pullman Porters, which are like foundational, hardcore labor movement stuff, is, it's unexpected.
Absolutely. Well, that was what I kept coming up with, the why. Again, the who, what, when, and where of Black Cowboys was pretty easy to find. There's a lot of information on African-American pioneers of the West that's out there and has been collected over time. Again, my first introduction came from two different sources to thinking about this idea. Besides being from Phoenix and myself, I ended up finding a book called The Negro Cowboys years back, which is a beautiful book on just Black Western culture in a general sense, because this history goes back into ancient times, and it goes back into early North American history, even before the United States is involved. So that in one way, that was a part of the history that I knew I couldn't delve into as far as I'd like to. This is also the reason I didn't end up going into Louisiana nor Florida cowboy history, because those are also connected to Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci and some of this early exploring history that, again, the general public wouldn't be able to swallow that much information on top of the information I was.
That's why you need a part two. You need a sequel.
I'm hoping one day I'd like to put together a sequel that would be I'd hope it to be something like an Afro-Latin historical project of some sort. It'd be beautiful, because there are a lot of things like the gear of cowboys, and then some of the different ways they did their hats, and some of the ways they did their work that are a big part of the history, that are especially connected to the pre-U.S. settlement North American history. So
right
into pre-1619 when you get into some of these notions. But I started out with first this book, The Negro Cowboys, and then I came across an album called Black Texicans, which featured field recordings of John and Alan Lomax. And Alan Lomax's liner notes are quite explicit that even though they didn't specifically try to record Black cowboys on the range, the recordings featured on the record that he had put together are some of the only examples of this very vibrant song tradition that he and his father had known about and had documented somewhat in their journeys. And so when I began to hear these field recordings, there's something that very different in the tonality. Like there's a song, Old Chisholm Trail. Usually it's sung something to the tune of, well, come along, boys, and listen to my tale, and I'll sing you a tale about the 2U trail. Come a kaya, yippee, come a kaya, yippee, yay, come a kaya, yippee, yippee, yay. But to hear Moses Clearrock Platt sing, whoop 'em up cattle, I'm setting up a saddle, and I'm riding around the cattle, and whoop da yiddle yay, yay, bum by the diddle yay. There was a tonality that to me symbolized and signified a subtle difference between Black and white cowboy music. That with the same songs, the same material, and the same people, sometimes there could be subtle differences between the way that the different cowboys sang. Of course, the African-American cowboys are part of the settlement of the West. And that's one thing, too, that really sets it into context, is as people were making their way out west, you have to think of early military convoys making forts before they've made towns and settlements. And so African-American people, whether in a subservient role as a soldier, as people that wanted to leave the deep South going out west, everybody everybody in every stripe and shade of life and of wealth and of social class made their way out west, and they did any number of jobs and any number of they lived any number of lives, from homesteading to being upper middle class and being part of the educational societies. And that was something that part of the African American women's story that I ended up finding. So just between those two sources, the Negro Cowboys and Black Texicans, I was able to start building on the foundation of the record. And I just ended up thinking of it as kind of a four-part record, knowing it was going to be a double vinyl LP. I wanted it to be a great double LP gatefold, like a classic record in that way. But it's set up as one chapter of it are songs associated with Black Cowboys that are stories that have been collected for years, like Home on the Range, which was collected from a Buffalo Soldier, and John Lomax collected that song very early on. And then Goodbye Old Paint, which is another song connected with John Lomax and his early field recordings. And he recorded a white fiddler named Jess Morris, who told Lomax that he'd learned the song from a Black cowboy named Charlie.
What years was he recording? When was that going on, his field recordings?
John Lomax was recording between 1910 and 1940, let's say. He did a little bit after that, but for the most part, his era started with cylinder recordings and written text of songs. And see, even the song Home on the Range has a interesting story with that as well. I went back to my good friends over at the Library of Congress, and I asked them about that original recording. And they mentioned, along with an accompanying article, that John Lomax had the cylinder recording transcribed onto sheet music. And the version that Tex Ritter and Vernon Delhart perform on their early recordings comes from this sheet music. But the sheet music was done off of this particular cylinder. There's a variant of the melody that's different than the other well-known Home on the Range that everybody sung. And the cylinder, in essence, crumbled into dust because they had to play it so much to transcribe it. So
there's no record of that now.
There's no record of that original recording except for the sheet music. And so,
were wax cylinders, was that the first way that music was recorded?
Yes, beside written notation.
But that's so interesting because, obviously as musicians, we know written notation and an actual performance can vary immensely. Yeah. So it sort of begs the question, like, if some of those songs have been kicking around for decades, and the way that music evolves, being passed down from generation to generation, like, it's kind of fascinating to think about, like, what would some of those songs have actually sounded like in the, mid to late 1800s, before there was any way to record them. I guess there's just no way to know,
Absolutely. Well, and that was one of the things that in the researching, trying to find any notion of how the music could have sounded, was my goal. And I found one very interesting reference. Once I started to bring this notion into my shows and start to build the record up, I started to find that the pure enthusiasm around Black Cowboys as a notion, that fell right upon me. And I found people in the audiences and fellow performers started to tell me every story they knew about Black Cowboys to help fill in a little bit more of the narrative that I wanted to tell. I went to the National Cowboy Poetry Gathering in Elko, Nevada, and I met a wonderful fellow by the name of Don Edwards, a great cowboy singer. And he told me that the old Black Cowboys that he had met called themselves Vaqueros Negros, the Black Vaqueros, because they were more connected to the Vaqueros because of the work they did, compared to just straight cowboys. And rarely did they refer to themselves as cowboys themselves, because there was a derogatory meaning around the word cowboy. And
really?
So that was something, because that was something that Don Edwards began to tell me. And as I looked up Vaqueros and their function within Spanish Mexican culture, it's true. They're one of the workers that help the rodeo and help the entire ranchero work as an entity. And so that was something interesting I found there. He also recommended that I pick up the autobiography of a fellow by the name of Jack Thorpe, who was he was not a folklorist like John Lomax, but 2 years before John Lomax, he began to collect cowboy songs and published his own book on cowboy music in I think it was 1908, and John Lomax published his book in 1910, Cowboy Songs and Frontier Songs, and so Jack Thorpe, when reading the autobiography, one of the most, again, serendipity of all things, the very first chapter speaks about Jack Thorpe going on the range. He begins working for an African American foreman, and as he walks into the camp, he finds a group of black cowboys sitting around the campfire, playing their banjos and singing about their cutting horses. And this inspired Jack Thorpe so much that he began to start collecting those songs. And it was interesting because it was two things I thought were funny about it. Was one, he said that no single cowboy knew more than one or two verses of any given song. And so that's what began to become a whole journey for him to figure out what are all the verses to any of the given cowboy songs.
Interesting. Almost like an oral history where people are adding to it as it goes along.
Like a song like the Chisholm Trail is said to have over 1,000 verses because it was a song that just to pass the time, the cowboys would come up with their own verses to be able to entertain the others. And so that was one piece of it. And then the other part was he described the song that these black cowboys were singing with a particular type of detail. He mentioned that they weren't work songs and they weren't the type of spiritual numbers he had heard before, but it was something that had a certain tone that was like a response to the loneliness on the range, he said. And to me, it just kind of reminded me of how we talk about the blues now. And there was a certain notion that there was a certain tonality that the cowboys were singing that, that inspired him in that way. And when I do Goodbye Old Paint, for example, I try to sing it in a particular way that has this sort of kind of a bluesy lift to it because it's only a 2-chord song. And that was something that inspired me as I was reading along, trying to piece together what Jack Thorpe might have meant.
Well, it's interesting, with roots music, in all its many forms, whether it's like old time or bluegrass, mountain music, old jazz, blues, whatever. There's a lot of racial overlap in that history. Famously, like somebody like Bill Monroe taking guitar lessons from a black railroad worker that he knew, or what. There's a lot of that sort of thing, sort of interspersed through the history of it. Was that the case out on the range with the black cowboys? Was it like black cowboys sitting around the campfire at the end of the day with the white cowboys, with the European immigrant cowboys, with the Mexican cowboys? Was it sort of a melting pot of influences making that music become what it became?
Well, I think it was. There was a book I read by a fellow named Bones Hooks, a guy named Matthew Hooks from Houston. And one of the things that he mentioned was that he said that if there was someone out on the range, and he said if a man was the type of man who would abuse me on the range, he wasn't man enough to stay on the range. And that was the sort of notion that a lot of these guys got, because they found that with only a small crew of men, you didn't have a chance to be discriminatory toward each other because someone could help you in a time of need. And that sort of balance led to a very mixed crew of people. They say that about 1 in 4 cowboys who settled the West were African American cowboys, working alongside the Anglo cowboys and the Mexican vaqueros, and that's about, they say a lot of crews are about 8 men, and many times a black cowboy might be the cook or might be one of the foremen or something like that. So you have to think of maybe one and two people in each given group might have a black cowboy within the group. And then also, of course, in the early settlement days, we have to think of, these are sort of the years leading up to the implementation of strict segregation in the years of 1900 and whatnot. So there were some spaces that were being opened up in the years of Reconstruction, and so this is also the results of that movement. And then also, once a segregation comes in, then you start finding that there's another history that grows. Of course,
And
then each individual state has its own subtleties as well, because of the farther, if you go as west as Tennessee, there's one type of settlement history, and then you go to Kansas and Nebraska, there's another type of settlement history. The history of the Missouri Compromise and the Kansas, Nebraska, territory struggles. So it really comes in waves.
so as Jim Crow was hardening into being an institutionalized thing post Reconstruction, would that have been the appeal then for lots of black cowboys? Like, because that was maybe there was more liberty, more freedom, less discrimination.
Absolutely. Well, you're going outside of U.S. state. You're going out of U.S. Jurisdiction in some ways, based on what period of time.
Right.
So you're going completely out of the United States into, into an unknown territory in essence. And I'll bringing it back to Nat Love. That's one of the reasons he became a Pullman Porter. He mentions that he just got sick of not seeing the open range anymore. And as he saw that the settlements began to come in and they began to faction out the land, he just found that it wasn't as appealing as a cowboy.
Well, continuing this into the modern era, and I know obviously you don't like inhabit the mainstream country music space, or whatever, but and I think Americana is is a big tent and is more diverse than you would maybe say mainstream country music has been. But I'm curious as to what your sense is of mainstream country music sort of evolution now. And it seems to me, and I'm not, to be perfectly honest, I'm not in that space either, so I don't really know, but like it seems to me from the outside looking in that it is at least visually making an attempt to diversify itself with more black artists or maybe more LGBTQ artists or whatever being sort of allowed through by the gatekeepers or however you want to view it, so I'm curious sort of what your take is on that, like where, not just in country music, but maybe the music industry as a whole, where do you think the sort of like institutionalized or systemic racism exists as sort of a roadblock for artists to get through?
Well, it's sort of interesting because now we're seeing a brand new situation where technology has come in, and also with the isolation that's come from the pandemic, I've seen that it's led to again a brand new space for people to think and to discuss and to be able to try to push the envelope forward. I've always tried to push the envelope forward wherever I can through historic music. And one of the ways I've done it is to, at least in the old timey music, is to try to give people the notion that the sound of the old timey music can be something different than you expect it to be. And so that alone has been a lot of what I've done in my work, is try to approach it like I've already made it. I've already belong in the spaces, and
Right.
because I've read the histories of a lot of the wonderful scholars that have asked those questions, have started those discussions. I've treated each of these discussions as being current to the current moment, and so I'm seeing now we're having a whole sea change with the way that people are thinking about, when it comes to country music, with African American country, there's two different types of Black country people. There's country and Western artists that are African American, but then there's Black rural people that do music. And those are kind of two different notions. And so we're starting to see the idea of people coming from rural communities bringing in their traditions or their musical sounds into the mainstream. And this is something that's been different because usually, African-American music has been somewhat urban, somewhat progressively minded, and has also come from, very metropolitan cities. And the more and more we've seen people, again, a lot of people are coming from Atlanta and Houston, and they're bringing a certain flavor that is just a different flavor than New York or Chicago. And that's just something that I think inherently I think is good. It mixes things up, but at the same time, it is also just a different sound. And I think that that's something that is, I'm someone that comes from a very different community, being from Phoenix, Arizona myself. So I relate in many ways, kind of being an outsider coming in some type of way. But at the same time, it's good. It's good to see that the doors are opening up instead of them being set in a certain pattern. For me, being a historically based artist, I've always found that the work I've done has, I found that I found doors have opened because of the historical work that I've done and the need for African American representation when it comes to talking about the history of any given music. So that's sort of kind of unique to my trajectory. But I find that that's happening all over the place. But with people are doing that with their culture and their identity, and they're putting that in the forefront.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'd be curious to hear how when Carolina Chocolate Drops were starting out, what your sort of sense of like, I mean, that's obviously not mainstream country music. It's sort of more under the Americana umbrella, but like if you guys felt embraced by the industry, or if there was any sense of like, unspoken sort of systemic institutionalized blockades to your success, or, anything like that.
Well, I think that one of the things that happened was that we hit him where no one had ever hit before, which was African American string band music. And that was one of the things that made me want to start the group in the first place, was that I saw that the scholarship for Black banjo and African American string band music and African American folk music in a broader sense was so underrepresented. It was just almost non-existent unless you were really looking for it. I found that bringing those things together in one place, which is one of the things we did with Carolina Chocolate Drops, made a very powerful statement with us only needing to play the music to reinforce that powerful statement. Of course, the idea of the banjo being an instrument of resistance, because it is an instrument that is African derived and of African and Caribbean nature, and it has survived as an instrument that both is an entertainment instrument, but is also an instrument that holds this very deep ancestral connection. That alone can change people's notion about the music they've been listening to for years, and to be able to allow people to have the notion of seeing a banjo player as being something, again, that you can find banjo players that you didn't expect to see. Not that there aren't banjo players from diverse communities that have been there, ever since the 60s, there have been, there's been a broad diversity of people who have been involved with a lot of these different types of music making. The 21st century needed a new group that was going to show that diversity and show that sort of new wave again. And so the Carolina Chocolate Drops came along at a time when all of the elements were right there, right in front of us. And for me, I saw that there was a great opportunity to be able to take the music as far as it could go. I didn't know exactly where that would go, but I knew that once we put the music out there, and once we started playing Georgia Buck and all that good stuff, that was something that was going to get people moving, and it did. And that was one of the things we got some resistance here and there, but there wasn't as much resistance as other people I've read about having in previous generations. And I think it was because people were ready. I think people were ready to want to embrace that idea of diversity within the deeper history of music, especially when it's sitting on the right under the surface. And that's something that we tried to put out there. And of course I do that as well. That's why I'm known as the American Songster, and not just by my own name all the time, is because there's a bigger notion in the music I'm trying to put out there as well, compared to it just being something I just do on my own.
Well, it's interesting too, because, there's like the sort of the industry and the people who work in the industry who maybe have more progressive views than the fan base. Yeah. It seems to me that those are two different two different things, you know, like people that actually go to the shows and their openness to it versus the, you know, the industry that provides access, or, you know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And with the drops, that was the thing with the group, was that we started out completely from the fan base building up. And we started with a very rural Southern audience in rural parts of North Carolina. We were playing in schools in Dudley and Goldsboro and Wendell and some very, some very out of the way places. And we just built this sound, and we built a following of people that really wanted to hear the old time square dance music. And I mean, we veered off into some other stuff along the way with like things like hit 'em up style and whatnot. But at the end of the day, the fans really wanted to hear things like Don't Get Trouble in Your Mind and Georgia Buck and Sourwood Mountain. And those were the things that really made the group just soar. And it was because we could also talk about what the songs meant too. And that was something that I think was very different for that time for our group, was that we were able to get some mainstream success. And see, the biggest resistance we got was talking too much in the shows. That was always
shut the fuck up and play.
Yeah, dispensing too much information in the concert. And again, there's always and again, I've figured out over time the ways to keep the music and the monologues in a good balance. But that was probably the biggest resistance we got of all, because if we had followed the industry example, they would have rather us have done 90 minutes and said nothing to the audience and just played
right.
the whole. But me being a guy that started out in folk music, and I also got to see Dave Van Ronk in concert when I was 18, way back in Phoenix. I took that format on. I took that storytelling format on. Just stories are fun to listen to, and then also as a performer, it gives you a second because I have a lot of instruments I keep around, so it also gives me a minute to recalibrate what I'm going to do next. So I've always appreciated getting some stories. It kind of it takes you into a different space with the song.
It's one of the things I love about going to see Billy Bragg. You know, I don't know if you've ever seen Billy Bragg live, but he tells these great stories, and and a lot of it's political. And he's got that thing where he can give you really bad news, but like make you laugh at the same time. You know what I mean? That's a real skill. You know, I'm telling you some horrible information about the power elite, but we're all going to have a chuckle, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's something kind of like celebratory in that. You know, I have to admit, I had never heard the term old time as a genre description until I, not that long ago, interviewed Ketch from Old Crow Medicine Show. And I think I referred to their band as a bluegrass band or something. And he kind of tuned me up like, no. We were playing old time. So for people listening that aren't familiar with it, what is old time? How would you define it?
Oh boy, old time. Well, let's see. So if we take bluegrass is a type of music where you have the fiddle, the banjo, the mandolin, the dobro, and the upright bass. And when the band plays all together, there are moments where you take solo sections like a jazz band. Now, old time music is more of a collective experience, and so there aren't solos necessarily. And it's a lot of it in a way. It's like a punk rock band for fiddle and banjo music, because it is really a style of music that is meant to be played, and I always define it as played until it's correct. It's a type of music that collectively you can get together and play, and it usually has fiddle and banjo as the foundation. You might have a guitar, but you might not have a mandolin necessarily, but there can be mandolin. But the ensembles generally tend to be just a little bit smaller than a bluegrass group. And the songs that are played are, they're a little less showy. They're a little bit more down home. And it's a type of music that's played on the porch. Now, and one of the reasons it's so hard to differentiate these styles of music is that bluegrass is an offshoot of old time music, but it's an offshoot from way back in the 1940s. So it's sort of the equivalent to what bebop jazz is to older types of jazz if you think of in the jazz world. So bluegrass ends up being its own sort of island that is that breaks into its own sort of musical rules. And old time music is the older style that reaches back into the colonial era that mostly is done for square dancing, but there are wonderful ballads and wonderful songs that are also within its repertoire. But it's sort of just a broad sort of catch-all umbrella for the old songs that go way back. And
what I was going to say, I imagine it was also punk rock in nature, maybe when you were getting into it, because I would assume you had to seek it out pretty, like it was not easily, like you couldn't find it very easy at your local record shop, pre-streaming. Now I guess it's probably more widely available, but it must have been kind of hard, like real niche.
Well, there are a couple of different levels of where old time has come from over time. Of course, there's the very old music that goes way back. That's a living part of Southern tradition, which is sort of underlying all of this. But in the 1960s, you had the folk revival. And within that early folk revival, you had groups like the New Lost City Ramblers, who really started to promote and emphasize the old time music. And you also had people like Doc Watson that were around, and Doc Watson's part of a very strong family tradition, even though now he's more associated with bluegrass now. But you had quite a few different old time musicians who were part of the 60s. And with that, you had an offshoot of folks that, again, you have to think of hippies that didn't want to go into psychedelic rock. There were ones that went straight into old timey music. And so you had groups like the Highwood String Band and again, there's a lot of different groups, the Red Clay Ramblers and whatnot. And from those groups, there was another notion of what I called fast old time music. And so like people like Old Crow Medicine Show and Carolina Chocolate Drops were a part of that movement. And there were quite a few bands when I started to go to the festivals around 2005 and 2006 that were playing fast old time music. It wasn't really bluegrass. It didn't rely on solos, but it was played very fast, very vibrantly, and definitely with the sort of a punk rock type of edge to it, because a lot of the hippie generation had kind of gotten into a sort of a slower mid-range tempo that, again, fit for social dance. And that was something that was very well rooted and placed within the community at that time. And so that had been there for two, three decades by the time, you had a group like Old Crow Medicine Show start to hit the scene. And so with that, Americana then began to sort of umbrella all of that sort of old time music into one thing. So by the time you got to about 2005, the idea of African American string band music was sort of one of the next steps in the process. But there hadn't been a young all African American group like our group. There had been other groups like there's a group that's still out there in New York City, the Ebony Hillbillies, who still play quite a bit. And in the blues, there are quite a bit of folk music practitioners who have always been around forever. I mean, everybody from Guy Davis to Taj Mahal, and there's a list of people, but they're all solo performers.
Right.
And so that was sort of the idea. And when we presented the music, my other two band members with me, Rhiannon and Justin, they were more or less the old time string band. And then what I brought was, I brought early rock and roll, jug band music, ragtime, fife and drum music. And then I brought some of Leadbelly's music and some of the other different guitar styles into the mix. And so we were also giving quite a grab bag of information. I mean, and I can't help but I think about people like, I was like trying to be like Rick Nelson of the group or something like that, where I had the funky banjos and had the fancy licks and things like that. So there was, even as we were evolving as a group, there was a notion of being modern and present within within what we were doing. But at the same time, it was old time music, so there had to be a certain flavor to it.
Okay, last question for you. I'm always curious with people who are multi-instrumentalists. Like when you're sitting at home on your couch watching TV, whatever, what instrument do you keep close? What's your main go-to?
Well, I usually keep the guitar close. I mean, it's the easiest one to pick a song or be able to just play a little number on or something like that. So I'm always picking on something, because since I'm a finger picker when it comes to writing, sometimes the little spontaneous sparks of creation can come in when you're just picking on an old favorite, and so I always keep it around.
Well, as I'm somebody that has a lot of what I think of as good intention musical instrument purchases. I have many things. I have a banjo, a mandolin, a pedal steel. I got a lot of stuff. I got a dobro. I got a lot of things that I've played a couple times, but I'm always very impressed with somebody that's like actually proficient in a whole bunch of different things. I'm like, where do you get the time? I'm just getting by on guitar, man. It's like I can't spend the time with the other stuff too. Anywho, hey man, it was fantastic talking to you today, man. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And I've just always been a big fan, so I was so glad to get the call that you wanted to speak with me.
Awesome. Yeah, well, it was great. I hope I see you out there on the road somewhere. I've never seen you play live, so I'd love to come out and see a show.
Oh, wonderful. Well, if you see that I'm going to be near, where are you based out of?
I'm in LA.
You're in LA, so okay.
Yeah.
So if next time I'm out there, I'll make sure to send a call down your way, and hopefully.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right, thanks so much, Chris.
Take care.
All right, that was the American Songster Dom Flemons on Walking the Floor. Go check him out and listen to his music and stream it and buy it and support it, man, because he's a cool dude and a great podcast guest. Great podcast guest. And, it's summertime, the sun is out, the waves are up, and I don't know if I'm going to stick to that once a week schedule anymore. I think that's over for the time being. I'll probably go back to 2 weeks. So I'll probably see you in a couple of weeks with another one, and we'll see what happens. You have yourself a great summer, kids. Adios, amigos!